that the behavioral dynamic of white supremacy is analogous to a chess game. We haven't looked at it in that way before. See, we've looked at it, everybody hold hands, ring around the room, we're all in this together. And we found that, wait a minute, that's not what's happening. That if we understand the game of chess, where you have a white side of the chessboard and you have a black side of the chessboard, when people sit down to play chess, because I'm not talking about hating white people. I am talking about analyzing the behavior. I'm not talking about hating them. I'm not talking about destroying white people. But I am talking about understanding this so-called game of chess. Now,
good evening. Welcome to For the People. History tells us that before the Africans encountered with the European, the African did not need food stamps, did not have broken homes, did not need welfare, did not need care packages from Europe, did not have single-parent families, did not hate black skin, did not worship a white image of God. No, these problems did not occur at the beginning of the African encounter with the European, but they began with the advent of white racism or white supremacy behavior. But while much scholarly attention has been focused on the victims of white supremacy behavior, there has been almost no serious scholarly examination of the white psyche that gave birth to white supremacy behavior. Dr. Francis Welsing, a Washington, D.C. based psychiatrist who has been studying white supremacy behavior for more than 20 years.
As you look at the economic, political, and cultural condition of African Americans, Africans around the world, what do you see as the primary obstacle blocking our development?
well, I label that obstacle one word, racism, or the phrase white supremacy. That believe that we need to understand racism in quite a different way. We need to understand white supremacy as we would understand science. And if we investigate that dynamic, not only locally, nationally, globally speaking, that we will be able to have a good insight into, what we refer to as poverty, or all problems of the so-called inner city, teenage pregnancy, you name it, failure in school and employment. If we understand racism, white supremacy at another level, we will be able to, solve these problems.
How do you define white supremacy or racism?
Well, I understand racism. Let me just go back.
Okay.
In the late 1960s, I wrote a paper on racism. The paper was really written for fellow colleagues in psychiatry because we were looking at racism. And if you remember, 20 years ago, people were having black caucuses and looking at the issue of racism during the civil rights era. And so I put down my thoughts about racism. And I titled the paper, I wrote The Crest Theory of Color Confrontation and Racism. Racism, supremacy. Crest is my maiden name. And so I titled the paper that. But basically, I looked at racism as a behavioral dynamic that came about because the white population in the world is a tiny minority population. It is also a genetic recessive population in terms of skin coloration. And so I looked at racism as behavior that evolved when this minority population that was genetic recessive found itself in a world, a planet in which the vast majority of the people, black, brown, red, and yellow, are not only the numerical majority, but they are genetically dominant in terms of skin coloration and could potentially cause white genetic annihilation. And so if the white population consciously or subconsciously desired to survive genetically speaking, you see, and not be, well, I think sometimes they use the term mongrelization of races, but genetic annihilation is the terminology that I use, then that would require that the white population hold an oppression all non-white people on the planet. black, brown, red, and yellow people. Now, of all the non-white people, black people have the greatest genetic potential to cause genetic annihilation. So when we were children, if you're black, they're black, brown, yellow, white, white. Now, those are the gradations of genetic production of this black pigment melanin. And so the more melanin you have, the greater threat to the fear of white genetic annihilation. So that's the way that I understand racism. And racism is not something that is operative at the economic level. That racism, to use the terminology of a gentleman named William Fuller, who has also written about racism, that is operative in all areas of people activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. In other words, there are behaviors that are carried out across the board in all areas of people activity to prevent white genetic annihilation or to maintain white genetic survival.
Two terms: genetic recessive and genetic annihilation. What do they mean?
Well, genetic recessive, the inability to produce melanin skin pigmentation, is a genetic recessive trait. A genetic dominant trait is the ability to produce melanin pigment. Now, melanin is the pigment it's a black pigment that causes skin coloration. And so the inability to produce that pigment is a genetic recessive trait, whereas a genetically dominant trait is the ability to produce it. And so that's why we mix black people and white people. The product is the product of color. The person is going to be a colored person.
Okay, so in Senator 2 again, the theory of color confrontation says what?
The Crest theory of color confrontation says that racism, white supremacy, is conscious and subconscious behavior to maintain genetic survival on planet Earth and to prevent white genetic annihilation.
Okay, the historic and psychological evidences that lead you to believe that racism is based in the fear whites have around genetic survival?
Well, perhaps I would say we have history, and we have, hundreds of years of oppression, what non-white people refer to as oppression. Sometimes it was referred to as colonialism, imperialism, slavery. For example, say slavery was a phase of white supremacy domination. That reaching out, going into Africa, going into Asia, going to other countries, going into Africa, and bringing African people. 50 million people were taken out of Africa. Going into Africa, enslaving people and bringing people to different parts of the world. So we have a historic record that demonstrates not only that white people came to this area of the world, there were brown people here, Native Americans, the various Indian nations, millions of people, you see, who are today even living on reservations, see, and they were slaughtered and they were taken off of the land. And they too caused genetic annihilation. In other words, if there was this mixing, you would have white genetic annihilation or, not white genetic survival.
Now, is the fear whites have around genetic survival the only thing that fuels white supremacy, or is there an economic component to it?
I say that the deep underlying, I'm a psychiatrist, and so I'm accustomed to looking for the core, of behavior. In other words, what is underlying behavior? I'm ask a psychiatrist, why do I do what I do? If the answer was just at the surface level, they'll be able to see it themselves. Sometimes you have to look very deeply to see, well, what is fueling, what is underlying this? And so I say that the fear of white genetic annihilation fuels all of the activity that we see.